The number of cases has begun to surge. In the last 7 days, 4 of them, we've seen more than 200 cases per day. The last few days have been around 116 to 150 cases each day. Nevertheless, it is becoming quite a worry for authorities here. The concentration of who is getting infected is actually mainly focused on young people 30 or below. 70% of the infections as of Monday had come from people 30 or under, and they're getting it in nightclub areas. Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. A very different breakdown to what we saw in March and April, around the peak of the virus here, where it was much older people who were getting the virus. But now it's young people, and it's coming from areas, night spots, red light districts of Shinjuku, Kabukicho, nightclubs, bars, drinking parties, and particularly host and hostess bars. And they're quite unique to this, to Asia, to Japan, and essentially they're bars where you go and have conversation with an attractive partner, male or female, with very high, very overpriced drinks. Now, a lot of the infections have come from these type of establishments, but it's very difficult to trace. It's a challenge for contact tracers because nobody wants to acknowledge that they've been going to these bars. So a lot of the infections are unknown, and finding where they've come from is unknown. So that's where you're seeing these significant proportions of unknown infections. They're coming from night spots, from people who don't want to necessarily open up to testing and admit that they've been to these bars.
And Jake, are there any restrictions still in place in Tokyo? Like in some places in Australia, it's still the case that if you go to a club, you've got to sit down and drink. You can't be dancing, and you can only have a certain number of people booking in for lunch in a pub. Are there restrictions like that in place in Japan?
There's nothing that's formally mandated by the government. Each individual club takes its own precautions, and that might be plastic sheeting or hosts or hostesses wearing kind of face mask type things, not actual masks, but more of a silk piece of fabric over their face. So they are taking individual precautions, but there's nothing mandated at a national or even local government level, and we saw that actually during the state of emergency. That was declared in April, in early April, expanded around the country, but it was only a request for businesses to close, and businesses that were involved in what's called the 3 Cs, closed spaces, crowded spaces where there were close conversations. They were asked to close, but there was no penalty if they didn't. The vast majority did in fact do that, but economic circumstances forced some to stay open. But it was a very different, very unique part of the soft lockdown, the lockdown light here in Tokyo, that's been very different to what we've seen elsewhere in the world, particularly in Australia.
Yeah. And so as you've been walking around town, have you been looking at situations thinking this is a recipe for a significant growth in coronavirus again?
Well, I think this is Greater Tokyo is an area of 30 plus million people. It is very dense to begin with. You don't have to look far to see those close, crowded spaces. I think there are circumstances where you sort of walk past a shop and go, oh, that looks pretty dense. But there are several reasons that authorities think the virus hasn't exploded out of control here in Japan. Number one, everyone wears masks. It's just a cultural thing. Everyone was wearing masks before this. So, it's the done thing. You just go out, you put a mask on, and so that probably limits the spread to some extent. But also there's very good access to healthcare here in Japan. It's very affordable. Everyone can get it generally, and so they're able to treat cases very early and very well. And also there's an excellent cluster tracing team here. They're called the Cluster Busters. And because when tuberculosis was spreading in Japan, every local government area had a number of public health centres, and they became very good at detecting tuberculosis outbreaks. They've been able to recalibrate and use those skills to jump onto clusters and detect clusters here now of coronavirus. So that's another reason that things have particularly helped Japan escape the worst of the coronavirus, certainly when you compare it to places like the United States or Europe, where there have been significant numbers of deaths.
Yeah, but those numbers are rising significantly now, and significantly in relation to what had been the case. So there is this red alert now. What is that? And is there any talk of restrictions being reintroduced?
Yeah, it's a good question because, you know, a red alert makes you think that there might be some significant lockdowns coming, some significant restrictions, but the reality is it doesn't change a lot. It is a warning for people to be vigilant that the coronavirus is spreading. The Tokyo governor has asked people not to travel to other prefectures for non-essential travel, but no businesses have been asked to close. There is some speculation that they might ask nightclubs and those host and hostess bars to close, to suspend business, but again, that would be voluntary. They might try to encourage it with some kind of payments to help them shut down, but again, that'll be nothing compared to the potential earnings. So it is this economic balance that businesses are facing here in Japan. Whether or not they do in fact close, they do acknowledge the voluntary shutdown request, but we haven't quite got to that point yet. And experts don't believe we're in a second wave, potentially on the brink of a second wave, but the difference between March and April, when things were at their peak here in Japan, there are around 105 concurrent critical cases in Tokyo, but if you compare that to now, there are only 5 critical cases. So that's why authorities are not extremely worried that we're in the middle of a second wave just yet. Of course, that 2-week lag time, we could be in a very different position in 2 weeks. We're all hoping that that's not the case and that people do take heed of this red alert and avoid the 3 Cs, those closed spaces and crowded, cramped circumstances.
Yes. And Jake, just before we leave you, I think you're pretty good with the Japanese language. You mentioned they call them cluster busters, so it rhymes in English. Does it also rhyme in Japanese?
Cluster buster, yes. So yes. So essentially, there's a particular type of Japanese language that sounds like that is spelt out. It's called katakana. And words like orange juice, orange juice, are just Western words that have been taken in Japanese. It certainly does. You can bluster your way through and people will generally figure out what you're trying to get.
Okay, Jake Sturmer reporting there from Tokyo.